especially thank you to Anna and Ella for having invited me to share my research along your wonderful projects. So this is very exciting for me. Now, the moment we all are terrified of, which is, will I be able to share my PowerPoint? Alrighty. As I mentioned in the foreword to the paper that I circulated a couple weeks ago, I'm going to zoom out from what I was looking at in the paper, where I was following the certain identity markers inscribed in what I call travel patents, which I will now talk about. So I'm going to zoom out from that close-up and talk about travel patents as a instrument of mobility and as a mobile document of identification more broadly. So I'm going to first very briefly mention a couple important terms and conversations that I have been thinking about while I research and write. Then I'm going to start looking at the documents themselves and talk about them and their structural features from a comparative perspective. And finally, I'm going to give a very brief recap of what I tried to make of it in the paper. Right. So, sorry, I actually have to move this little indicator so I can see my slide better. There we go. Right, so identification between controlling the legitimate means of movement and gaining access to resources. Now, the history of identification has become very complex in the Mediterranean and in other places within the last 20 years, I would say. But in my experience, it roughly falls within, interpretations roughly fall within two camps. Uh, aha, one which looks as processes of identification tied to mobility as top-down, state-driven, aimed at securing the legitimate means of movement. I'm a bit trivializing the approaches, so they are more nuanced than I am making them out to be. And this approach tends to focus on the connection between the control of mobility and state formation. John Torpe, Valentin Grobner. The other approach that I'm also thinking about is a more bottom-up kind of drive towards identification, which is driven by individuals and groups who desire access to resources. And here I think of Simona Ceruti's understanding of identification processes and also of Tamar Herzog's work, for example. Identity versus identification, which is something that comes out in my paper. So what are identity and identification? Well, I would say that identification is a process through which a specific, often legal identity is established and recognized. And I build on Stuart Hall's definition from 2011, but also Simona Ceruti's sort of reelaborations. Should we prefer the terms identity to identification? This is a big question. My answer to that is it depends on what you want to do. They are different tools that provide different kinds of historical inquiry. What about identity papers versus identification papers? And here I can become a bit more specific, I think. So the primary purpose, in my opinion, of identity papers is to prove that the person who carries a document is who they say they are. Purpose of identification papers is to prove that the carrier has a specific privilege, right, or exemption. And in that sense, most early modern travel papers I am familiar with, including the ones I'm talking about today, like patent letters, are identification and not identity papers. But what are patent letters? So the patent itself is a very famous type of document. It is used to provide, it is an open letter issued by a sovereign. It grants a privilege or an exceptional right from at least the 14th century in the series that I have been working on. These exceptional rights include rights tied to mobility, the right not to be harassed or detained, the right to be aided along the way while traveling. They are ad hoc. They respond to a specific case, usually addressed via petition by a traveler, but they are reoccurring. They show up constantly throughout the 16th century, which is the century I've primarily focused on. They are not individual in today's sense, by which I mean that a single document usually covers a carrier and their retinue. If we think of, for example, an ambassador, it could cover an entire ship. It could cover a family. not necessarily a single person, but they are distinct from charter-like documents, which instead sort of are addressed or geared towards, let's say, protecting an entire community. And this is one last small point. They make no real distinction between people and goods. This is something typical of early modern travel documents in general. So the document that you see on the image in the center is the sort of chancery record that I drew from the Libri Bullarum from the Order of St. John's records of a patent of safe conduct granted to Turkish merchants or Ottoman merchants more correctly. And in the course of my research, I've collected, a lot of these documents, which I have analyzed comparatively. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, I'm happy to go into more details. The reason I show this is that the records of the documents in the Chancery books, which is what I've mostly drawn my sources from, can be extensive, like in the case of this first image, or they can be just small notes, as in this Ottoman Register of Important Affairs, the Muhime Defterleri. It just tells us that a document was issued, a travel paper was issued for the in this case, ambassadors from England. The fact that the Ottoman document is very synthetic and the Hospitaller one was more extensive is just a function of these specific registers. It's not like an extensive chancery tradition. Now, if we start looking at the structure of a patent letter, travel patent, which I have broken down, and these structures are very important, right? We heard a lot yesterday, a very interesting description of the charters for VAC foundations. And these type of documents follow very similar structured formats, which are important to give them authority and validity. The main ones we can see in this case of a Venetian travel patent are the inscriptio, which is an address formula, the narrative, narratio, in which the document explains why the paper was issued. And then we have the dispositio, which tells us what the issuing magistracy, in this case, the heads of the Council of 10, the Capi del Consiglio dei 10, what they expect to happen upon seeing the document. And as a small side tour, I would note that, interestingly, if we look at the formats of, let's say, Latinate, Italianate documents and Ottoman documents, which these are both my translations, so perhaps some of the affinity also comes from the fact that I translated them both, so they might be more different than I make them out to be. But my point would be that there are very similar formal structures that are shared across the Mediterranean. They aren't exactly overlapping, but I take this to be an indication of what John Wansbrough had once referred to the chancery lingua franca of Mediterranean diplomatic and commercial culture, which I'm also happy to talk about less, as I am sort of trying to write a book on that in the next year of my life, I guess. Now let's go into the documents. We are now in the Archive of Florence. Before anybody has a heart attack, I did not color the documents themselves. I did this on the photographs that I had. And I use this, these two images, these two document examples to show you a difference in the address formula, which is very important. They point to different registers. The first one is a mandate, which is an internal command. It's an internal travel register. And so in the case of our document here, it says, can you see my cursor actually? Yes, so I can actually show you without doing, okay, so because blah, 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 it's comandiamo, we order all I nostri, very important, they had to add nostri, our rectors, not anybody else's rectors, officials and so and so and so to do what the document prescribes. On the other hand, we have a document that says, preghiamo caramente, we pray dearly, all of the predetti o prefatti, and if we go up to the inscriptio, we see that the prefatti were all of the princes, the gentlemen, the officials, the dazieria, customs officials, private people who will happen upon this document. So one is internal to the state. The other one is external to the state, if we want to use the word state, which I actually don't do very much, but in this case it works. And this distinction indicates sort of an administrative and a instead diplomatic registers. And if we sort of break down like the registers in, for example, the patent series I have examined, we see some interesting trends, which I'm happy to come back to any of these tables later, but I'm just pointing out that, for example, in the Venetian series, almost all the documents are internal. They're meant to circulate within the dominions of Venice and among Venetian officials, while in the Hospitaller series, not so. About 54% are explicitly external and only 10% are intended to circulate within the, it must be said, relatively small jurisdiction of the Hospitaller order. Something else that we can look up, diving back into the Florentine archive. So here, what I really care to point out is we have a salvacondotto, a safe conduct, right? Safe conduct is something very specific in the series I have been studied. And it's important to note that it was given to this Lorenzo, who is bandito dallo Stato nostro per omicidio. So he was banished from our state for homicide. And he is allowed to come back into the state, to stay there, to leave. These are all terminologies that are typical of safe conducts and not of other travel patents. And that he is allowed to do this, and here is the important part, nonobstante detto bando, despite the banishment. Despite is crucial. A travel patent that is not a safe conduct is saying, this person is a good person, treat them well, don't bother them. A document that is a safe conduct in these registers is saying, this person is a bad person. He or she is an enemy of the prince. But despite that, the prince wants you not to bother them. It also makes sense that safe conducts are almost always internal, though they can have some external valenza, some external uses as well. Again, if we break down the patent series that I've looked at following these lines, we can break down safe conduct types into criminal, financial, military, and for non-Christians. The first two are what is called procedural safe conducts in sort of jargon. And one thing that is very important that we notice just comparing the two series is that, for example, Malta, or the Order of St. John rather, has a very high percentage of safe conducts given to non-Christians. This is something that, for example, Joanna Bela has studied very well recently. These are people who are coming to perform those same usually from North Africa, but from Istanbul as well, who are coming to perform those same actions that Anna mentioned earlier. So they're ransoming captives, and to get to Malta or to Rhodes, a lot of them want these safe conducts for extra protection against the order's warships and corsairs. Last point that I'm making on the documents is that the narrative, now we're looking at the narrative. Before we were looking at the dispositio. I'm sorry if I didn't mention that. So the narrative here tells us that this person who is Servadio de Damasco Greco, so the Greek Servadio from Damasco, he's going to the lands of the Levant. He wants to do business with Greek, Turkish, Persian merchants. He wants to come back with the merchandise in our state. Because of all these reasons, don't bother him. He's doing something useful. That's why the Prince of Florence wants him to be able to do this. Now, the narrative gives us a lot of information about why a document was issued, which allows us to do something like that, for example, realize that though these documents could, in theory, address all kinds of travel problems because they're very flexible, and we heard something very interesting yesterday also about the flexibility of early modern Venetian, I believe, administrative processes. They can address all types of travel, but it turns out if you look at series, they tend to cluster around a discrete amount of purposes. Besides that, though, the narrative is also very important because it justifies the existence of a legal exception which the patent letter is creating. So it makes a case for why the document exists, why the travel that it sponsors is legitimate, and why it should be not impeded. Again, if we look at the chart very quickly, one thing that we notice is that though uses sometimes overlap, and though the document types from a chancery perspective are the same, patent letters, in fact, the administrations of the Hospitaller Order and of Venice are using them for different purposes. Once again, trading goods and ransoming captives is very high in the Hospitaller case, while it's very low in the Venetian case. The Venice had other means of doing it. They had the Bailo in Istanbul and so on. They didn't need it. They didn't need it, so they didn't issue the documents. Right, in my article, in very brief, so I've sort of taken a lot of information about the carriers that I found in my article that I circulated with. I'm trying, I realize it's a bit of a Frankenstein article because it puts together three different things, trying to make sense of them together. But essentially, I first established that travel patents provide their carriers with a form of legal identity that I have called political affiliation. This identity was highly recognized across the Mediterranean, and this is pretty easy to demonstrate. Travel patents' primary concern was to identify the prince who had issued them and the type of privilege, not the carrier. And I go into a long discussion about why people were not identified with physical traits in patent letters, which was something that was done in other aspects of early modern administration. And finally, and this is the last point I'm going to sort of mention, travel patents were primarily granted to individuals who had previously enjoyed relatively low political proximity with the prince. And my question sort of for a group of early Mediterraneanists would be, does this thing that I've done make any sense? I have tried, and in the paper I explain how I try to differentiate the various degrees of political proximity to show that, oh, in both cases, it's mostly people who have low political proximity who get the documents. Why? I don't exactly know, possibly because people who were, for example, Venetian nobles or citizens had other ways of proving that they were Venetian nobles and citizens. Um, and I would make a shout out in this chart. So for one category, which is very important, which is this of the Venetian faithful, these are the fedeli. And I'm using the analysis of this term that Umberto Signori, who I believe is in the audience, has put forth in his wonderful dissertation. Um, right. So my ending question is essentially, does this chart particularly make any sense? Is it something that has legs, or should I just trash it? And yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our conversation.